Hey, it's Charlie from Charlie Reads and Reviews, and it's a midway check in on the books that I've read so far this month. So, I've had a great reading month so far. I've read about 8 books. Four of them have been audiobooks that I listened to on Scribed or Script. Three of them have been physical books, and one has been an ebook that I also read through Script or Scribed, however you pronounce it. I prefer Scribed personally, but I've been told that Script is how the company pronounces it. All right, so I thought it would be cool for me to kind of just do a quick review of those 8 books and then also talk about some of the books that I am presently reading and planning on reading. So the first book that I finished was an audiobook, and that was a classic. Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston, and it was narrated by Ruby Dee. Now, this classic, I suppose when it was written, it was contemporary fiction, literary fiction. I think it was set in the 1930s in the US, and we watch how African Americans try to establish themselves by building out their own town. And a lot of the story is completely told from the perspective of the protagonist, whose name I cannot recall right now, unfortunately. But she is a young woman who is beautiful, but unfortunately, due to societal pressures, is forced to get married really young to save her virtue. And so we watch her coming of age over time, finding her voice, finding herself, until eventually she gets an opportunity to experience life on her own terms. Thoroughly enjoyed this book. This is a brilliantly narrated, brilliantly written classic, and I gave it 5 stars. The next book was also an audiobook, and this was In the Dreamhouse by Carmen Maria Machado. This is a memoir that is predominantly centered around a relationship that Carmen had with another woman in which she experienced domestic violence. But it also reflects on her life in general, going back and forth in time from when she was young to post the relationship ending. And we explore just how she has managed to, I guess, find healing, what she was experiencing when she was going through this, as well as some of the challenges that she faced around societal's assumptions around what is defined as domestic violence and who qualifies for, I guess, sympathy, having a voice, acknowledgement. Domestic violence in general, or intimate partner violence in general, is a harrowing experience, regardless of who is the partner that is inflicting it. But I think to have to fight the system even more, just to be seen or heard, probably compounds that trauma in a way that I have not really heard anyone talk about in the past. So I appreciated that. I did listen to this, and I did find that there were some parts that went over my head. It was not written in a chronological format. It would go back and forth in time, and I suspect it was written in verse. I don't have a physical version of the book to check, but it's definitely a book that I would want to get a physical version, because I suspect that listening to it reduced the quality of my experience of the reading. But overall, though, it was a brilliant book, and I gave it a rating of 4.75. The next book that I listened to was What Storm, What Thunder by Miriam J.A. Chauncey and narrated by Ella Turen. And this is a fictional story that is a literary fiction that is set in Haiti during the disaster that happened. I can't recall what year it was. It might have been 2006, 2010. I'll get the correct date and either way put it up there. And in this story, we follow several people's lives. I'm not sure how many people we went through, but in essence, every single chapter featured a different person. Initially, I thought it was a collection of short stories, but over time, you start to see how the people are actually connected to each other. And so, I guess, in a way, whilst it is a short story, because we see each person's experience in the build up to the event, during the event, and if they're fortunate to have lived on post the event. It touches on a lot of things, like what Haiti, a lot of things around living in Haiti, the good and the bad. It also touches around the actual event and how it really was agnostic about your station in life and whether you're a sinner or a saint in terms of how it impacted you, as well as what happens to people post. And when I say post, a lot of times we tend to think about just the actual event as being the most traumatic aspect, but for refugees living in tents, just the violence that can impact them. But I felt that it was also well written in that it also incorporated the ways in which people survive such trauma and such events. And it just gave you a bit of hope about humanity, despite some of the horrific things that are depicted in it. Thoroughly enjoyed this book. Gave it a 4.75 halos. Definitely want to get a physical version of it. Then, the beauty that is... You made a fool out of death with your beauty by Akwekwe Emezi. This is my third read of their works. So I physically own 3 of the 6 books. But the ones that I have read, 2 of them are audiobooks that I listened to on Scribd or Scribed. And I definitely do want to get physical versions of them. That's Bitter and Pet. Those are middle grade type books. And they are fantasy, so it is very different to this, which is a romance. And in the story, we follow Faye. Faye is a young woman in her late 20s. She is a widow of about 5 years at this stage. She has been struggling to come to terms with the death of her husband, the love of her life, who died in an accident that she was a part of. And so she's suffering from survivor's guilt. She's struggling to move on. There's a lot of things that she's working through. And she tends to put all of that pain in a form of catharsis through her art. And this is what will end up giving her a pathway towards ending up on this island where she'll meet the man who will end up being a man she'll madly fall in love with. And I don't think this is a spoiler because a lot of people have mentioned this, who is perfect for her, but not necessarily how they got together is the best way. So it's a messy book in terms of just how her and the man she chooses end up together. But I thought that it was such a well-written book around certain things like depicting positively consent. The 3 men that are featured in different sexual situations in this book, all 3 of them at different points in time continually ask and confirm consent, and they don't confirm it by, she nodded her head, she smiled this way, she looked like she was into it. They actually physically ask and continue to confirm until they are sure that Faye has given consent. And I loved that representation because I think we need to see more of that. The fact that despite the fact that Faye herself sometimes might have been a little bit frustrated or irritated about how many times do I have to say yes, that this is what should be normalized. It should be normalized that a man must confirm consent throughout, just because of the power differences that tend to happen in a relationship where it's a man and a woman. And I think in any relationship where there's a power difference, that the person with the power should continue to confirm consent throughout that sexual interaction. Absolutely love that representation. Another thing that I know a lot of people kind of swept over, but I just felt like there was a good representation of what a healthy relationship is. A healthy relationship means that not necessarily that everyone's going to come in completely healed and completely sane and completely perfect, but you're going to come together, and the healthiness is in the appearance where somebody says, I'm here, I want to be with you. And if you don't want to be with me, just say it up front right now, and we can go our separate ways. I don't want to convince you to stay in this relationship, and I don't want to keep having to convince you that I want you, that I want to be with you. Like, this is it. I'm saying it now, and you either believe me or you don't, and we step apart. I love that. I think that's important to highlight there. Another thing that was really highlighted quite importantly around healthy relationships was the fact that you need to own your healing journey, understand what are your triggers, what are the things that need to be healed, and go see a therapist. That representation in this book I think was absolutely brilliant, and I love there was representation in a Black romance. And so a lot of people will go on about, oh, it's so messy, etc., but there was so much beauty in this book about what relationships real relationships really look like. And despite the messiness, the messiness was, I was cringing, but I loved the actual relationship that she ends up having in this book. Thoroughly enjoyed this. 5 stars, as you can see, all of my tags. A 5-star read. Then the next book was very different, also a physical book, and this was a nonfiction, my first nonfiction of the month, and this was 491 Days by the late Winnie Madikizela Mandela. Winnie was married to the late Nelson Mandela, and in this particular memoir, we're looking at a time where Nelson Mandela has been arrested, and he's now served about 5 years on Robben Island. He's basically there for life, and she is starting to see that the apartheid government is ramping up how incendiary they are being in, or insidious they are being in handling anyone that they feel is a troublemaker. And she, as the wife of one of the chief troublemakers that they view, who is seen as an extension of Nelson Mandela, they see that she is basically open source to attack. In 1968, the South African government passes the Terrorism Act, looking at you, America. And in this act, what it enables the South African apartheid government to do is to detain a person for as long as they want without charging them. The reasons why they do this is that as soon as you charge a person, they have rights to things such as they have rights to food, rights to visitors, rights to see their lawyer, rights to receive letters and to take notes, to basically prepare adequately for their court case. And so by detaining her without charging her, what they're able to do in essence is to torture her as well as her co-conspirators, her co-accused. So in this 491 days, whilst this is just a glimpse of what she experienced, a glimpse of her struggling, we start to see just when the apartheid government started to, crank up the torture and the violence, in particular against women. And I think that this is such an important read. So it's split up into 2 parts. The first part is based off of actual notes that she took during her incarceration, that she was putting together for her lawyer for her defense case. And throughout there, you really see the rawness of just what they did to her. I'm surprised she lived until she died at 81 or 82 years old. I don't even know how she made it to there, because she really should have died they were trying to kill her. So it's actually pretty phenomenal that she lived as long as she did. In the second part, it's letters, and so it tends to be letters by Nelson Mandela. And as beautifully as he writes, some of it felt a little bit repetitive, but by the time you get to the end of all of the letters, you understand why they chose the letters they chose, why there was an aspect of repetition. It was, I guess, a way to just show just how frustrating the apartheid government was even trying to be towards them. They literally had 2 young daughters, I think they were aged 10 and 8 at the time, who were left alone the night that she was captured. So they came to her at like 3 a.m, took her, left her daughters unaccompanied, unaccounted for, and they didn't even ensure. And perhaps they had, but they didn't tell the parents, because both their parents are now detained. What had happened to their daughters? Letters that Nelson would write would go missing. Letters that he would be sent would go missing. And so we see that frustration building up. On occasion, we get some letters from Winnie as well, but then we also realize that in some of her letters, she'll be like, I'm not sure if you got my letter, and we don't actually read it, so I'm sure some of them were destroyed by the apartheid government. This is an important read for all South Africans in particular, but anyone who really is interested in understanding what women have had to do for our freedoms should read this book. I gave it 4 stars. Then the next book that I finished was an ebook. It was Elsewhere Home by Leila Abulela. It's a book I started in July, and then I kind of burnt out a little bit at the end of July. And so after 491 days, I wanted something that was a little bit of a palate cleanser before I went into my epic fantasy books. And so I started off with Elsewhere Home, or I completed Elsewhere Home. So it's a collection of, I think, 14 short stories that are centered around Sudanese men and women who are either based in Sudan or are based in the UK, predominantly Scotland, and are visiting Sudan, and other parts of the world are also featured. The whole purpose of these short stories is just to look at what it means to be a Sudanese in diaspora, the things that it impacts, like in terms of your identity, your culture, your religion, what love means, so many things that I really enjoyed it. I can't say that there was any book that I absolutely hated and couldn't get through. I thought they were all relatively enjoyable, and I think the ratings I would give would range anywhere from 3 to 4.75. And so overall, I gave it a rating of 4 stars. Then the next book that finished. So this book is a book that I've owned since 2020, and I've been holding off reading, and finally, look how much I loved it. And finally I got to it. So I started reading it this past weekend, and I will admit, like, initially when I started reading it, I really was struggling, and I was like, oh no, I'm not going to love this book. I was really worried. But I think when I got to about like 30%, I just couldn't put it down, and I had to find excuses to read it. So in this story, we're set in a world that looks very similar to ours. It has continents, but the population we are aware of are based on one continent, and apparently they say that there's no other life on the other continents. It's a world that is basically trying to kill them. And when it tries to kill them, it basically destroys, it creates an apocalyptic event that can have a fallout that can last anywhere from decades to centuries or to millennia. And so in this book, we're following 3 points of views. 2 of them are in the first person point of view and 1 in the second. Now, I've heard lots of complaints from people who attempted to read this book saying they struggled with the second person point of view. And I can see where that happened, because that's probably where I was initially struggling, that first 30%. But I encourage you to push through, because by the time you get to the end, you understand the genius that is N.K. Jemisin as to why that point of view had to be in second POV. It was phenomenally executed and really shows me what a genius of an author she is. And I cannot wait to read the book 2 and 3. I've decided to pace myself and say I'm only going to get to 2 in September and 3 in October, because I got a bunch of books I need to read. But thoroughly enjoyed this book, and I gave it 5 stars. And then the last book that I managed to finish was, again, another audiobook, and this was The City of Brass. I actually have a physical version of it. Let me just pull it up. All right, so I can put it up here. I listened to it, I didn't read it. This book arrived after I'd already started reading it, and I am now physically reading a different book. So I decided I'll leave this. I finished The City of Brass, but when I do plan on rereading it, I'll reread it physically. So The City of Brass by S.A. Chakraborty, or Shannon Chakraborty, is a fantasy that is inspired by Islam and by Islamic culture and countries that have a very strong Islamic influence in terms of their cultures incorporated into it. So it starts off in the streets of Cairo, where we follow Nari, who is the main protagonist, who is a 20-year-old street hustler who has a strange ability to pick up any language that she tries. She can very fluently speak 5 languages that from around the world, and a very strange language that she's not sure how to name. She also has the strange ability to sense when someone is not feeling well and what that source of that pain is, and potentially even heal them. But this she tries to keep to herself, until one day she's attacked by something she believes doesn't exist, and suddenly her whole world implodes. The other second point of view is Ali, who is the son of the king in a region that is known as Devabad, which is kind of somewhere in the Middle East because it's close to the Euphrates River. And when I went to go Google the Euphrates, it goes across several different countries, from like Turkey down past Syria. So it really is, I'll say, the Middle Eastern area. And he is the second son to a king in a culture where they do not believe in having a second son. They believe that if you give birth to a second son, you conveniently ensure that he does not make it past a certain age, so that there is no contest around who takes over the throne, which I thought was a very interesting cultural thing that I need to Google to figure out if there are any cultures that believe in that. And so he's got this big sense of, I need to prove myself. He loves his brother, but there is some kind of tension there, unspoken tension growing there. And he was also raised in a citadel, so he's very, very religious. And so whilst it makes him very loving to like the poorest and the most downtrodden people in society, it also makes him very rigid and strict about people who are living on the margins of a religion. And so sometimes he can be quite cruel and quite angry at things that he believes are against the religious texts or against his, which are forbidden or haram. So really interesting. Enjoyed this book thoroughly. It's very fast paced. There's a lot of violence, but I didn't think it was gratuitous, so I didn't have a problem with it. And I felt like the love interests were very interestingly included into the book in some interesting ways. And I'm very keen to check out what happens with Kingdom of Copper Book 2. Thoroughly enjoyed this, gave this 5 stars. I understand why everyone loves the Devabad trilogy. And so I've actually started Kingdom of Copper. So that's it. Sorry, let me just stop there. That's it. Those are the 8 books that I've read so far. As you can tell, I've had a really great month. I think the lowest rating I gave was a 4, which for me is still a pretty great rating. So let's talk about the books that I'm currently reading really quickly. So I'm listening to presently, I think it's called I'm Happy My Mom Died. Let me just check the name. I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jeanette McCurdy, whom I didn't know. I had to go Google that she's the actress from iCarly. That was like after my time. That time. So this stuff my younger sisters used to watch. And it's probably, or even was it my younger sisters? Either my younger sisters or my niece. Somebody in my household who was younger than me watched this, and that's the only reason I even know what iCarly is. So it's an interesting memoir about being a child actress and just her tumultuous and tricky relationship with her mom. Really am enjoying it, but at this point in time, I'm about 50% through. It's not going to be my best memoir of the year, but it's a good book. I'm definitely enjoying it. Then the next one I'm also listening to is Kingdom of Copper. The only reason I picked up I'm Glad My Mom Died, was because I was like feeling like things were a bit heavy in terms of the books that I'm, going from the 5th season to City of Brass and then go to Kingdom of Copper. So it was nice to have, as much as I'm Glad My Mom Died is still touching on heavy topics, it's just from a different angle. So it's not as like hectic in terms of violence and politics and etc. So that was a palate cleanser for me. And I guess the other reason why it's a little bit of a palate cleanser is the other physical book that I'm presently reading is, yes, I know, I decided to catch up on all of the fantasy books that everybody has loved and I owned and haven't read. So Jade City by Fonda Lee, I am about 10% in. This morning I started reading and I'm now really getting into it. And I was like, oh, I'm in trouble. But I've got like an event tonight. But I'm going to make a plan about when I'm going to get to the rest of this book. But it's going to be finished this weekend for sure. And then some other hopefuls that I'd like to get to. I'd like to read The Dinner Guest by Gabriela Ibarra. It is translated from Spanish to English. It's also quite short, and so it'll count towards women in translation. As I'm sure you've seen on my TBR, I said that I only want to read books written by women, but I also found out that this month is Women in Translation Month, so I do want to make sure I do read a book that's been translated as well. Potentially the yield is a little bit bigger than I'd like it to be. It's like, okay, it's 340 pages, so it's shorter than the fantasy books, but I'll see. The reason why I want to read this month is next month I know I'm going to be picking up heavy on fantasy and sci-fi, and so I really wanted to try and read this book. This is a book written by an Aboriginal from Australia, and I haven't read anything from Australia in a long time, like fully completed a book from Australia, I don't think. Or if I have, not in a very long time. And this is from an Aboriginal person's perspective. So I'm really, really interested in reading that. Zainab Takes New York by Aisha Haruna Atta. And this is being adapted for film, for screen. Let me say for screen because I don't know if it's a film or TV. And so I'm really keen to get into this. It's also quite short, 250 pages. So hoping to also get to that. And then another Women in Translation is The Mad Women's Ball by Victoria Mars. This is also just 204 pages, quite short, so it would count towards Women in Translation. And then the last hopeful, well, this is not the last hopeful, but the one that I have with me right now is Manchester Happened, a collection of short stories. This is a reread, And so it really should go quickly. I could probably pick it up like as a palate cleanser, but I do want to finish it this year, the reread this year. Other potential hopefuls that I haven't put here are Know My Name by Chanel Miller and Minor Feelings by Kathy Park Hong. So there you have it, halfway through the month. Brilliant month so far, and even my hopefuls are planning to be great. So let me know if you are planning to read any of the books that I've mentioned, if you've read any of the books that I finished this month, what you thought about them. What are you really keen to read for the rest of this month? Cheers.